from the most desperate, hopeless condition that ever I had been in all my life. Thus, what is one man's safety is another man's destruction. For it seems these men, whoever they were, being out of their knowledge, and the rocks being wholly under water, had been driven upon them in the night, the wind blowing hard at east-northeast. Had they seen the island, as I must necessarily suppose they did not, they must, as I thought, have endeavored to have saved themselves on shore by the help of their boat. But their firing off guns for help, especially when they saw, as I imagined, my fire, filled me with many thoughts. First, I imagined that upon seeing my light, they might have put themselves into their boat and endeavored to make the shore, but that the sea running very high, they might have been cast away. Other times, I imagined that they might have lost their boat before, as might be the case many ways, particularly by the breaking of the sea upon their ship, which many times obliged men to stave or take in pieces their boat, and sometimes to throw it overboard with their own hands. Other times, I imagined they had some other ship or ships in company who, upon the signals of distress they made, had taken them up and carried them off. Other times I fancied they were all gone off to sea in their boat, and being hurried away by the current that I had been formerly in, were carried out into the great ocean, where there was nothing but misery and perishing, and that, perhaps, they might by this time think of starving, and of being in a condition to eat one another. As all these were but conjectures at best, so, in the condition I was in, I could do no more than look on upon the misery of the poor men and pity them, which had still this good effect upon my side, that it gave me more and more cause to give thanks to God, who had so happily and comfortably provided for me in my desolate conditions, and that of 2 ships' companies who were now cast away upon this part of the world, not one life should be spared but mine. I learned here again to observe that it is very rare that the providence of God cast us into any condition so low or any misery so great, but we may see something or other to be thankful for, and may see others in worse circumstances than our own. Such certainly was the case of these men, of whom I could not so much as see room to suppose any were saved. Nothing could make it rational so much as to wish or expect that they did not all perish there, except the possibility only of their being taken up by another ship in company, and this was but mere possibility indeed, for I saw not the least sign or appearance of any such thing. I cannot explain, by any possible energy of words, what a strange longing I felt in my soul upon this sight, breaking out sometimes thus: "Oh, that there had been but 1 or 2, nay, or but 1 soul saved out of this ship, to have escaped to me, that I might but have 1 companion, 1 fellow creature, to have spoken to me and to have conversed with." In all the time of my solitary life, I never felt so earnest, so strong a desire after the society of my fellow creatures, or so deep a regret at the want of it. There are some secret springs in the affections which, when they are set a-going by some object in view, or though not in view, yet rendered present to the mind by the power of imagination, that motion carries out to the soul, by its impetuosity to such violent, eager embracings of the object that the absence of it is unsupportable. Such were these earnest wishings that but 1 man had been saved. I believe I repeated the words, "Oh, that it had been but 1," 1,000 times, and my desires were so moved by it that when I spoke the words my hands would clench together, and my fingers would press the palm of my hands, so that if I had any soft thing in my hand I should have crushed it involuntarily, and the teeth in my head would strike together and set against one another so strong that for some time I could not part them again. Let the naturalist explain these things, and the reason and manner of them. All I can do is to describe the fact, which was even surprising to me when I found it, though I knew not from whence it proceeded. It was doubtless the effect of ardent wishes and of strong ideas formed in my mind, realizing the comfort which the conversation of one of my fellow Christians would have been to me. But it was not to be. Either their fate or mine, or both, forbade it, for till the last year of my being on this island, I never knew whether any were saved out of that ship or no. I never knew whether any were saved out of that ship or no, and had only the affliction, some days after, to see the corpse of a drowned boy come on shore at the end of the island which was next the shipwreck. He had no clothes on but a seaman's waistcoat, a pair of open-kneed linen drawers, and a blue linen shirt, but nothing to direct me so much as to guess what nation he was of. He had nothing in his pockets but 2 pieces of 8 and a tobacco pipe. The last was to me of 10 times more valuable than the first. It was now calm, and I had a great mind to venture out in my boat to this wreck, not doubting but I might find something on board that might be useful to me. But that did not altogether press me so much as the possibility that there might be yet some living creature on that board, whose life I might not only save, but might, by saving that life, comfort my own to the largest degree. And this thought clung so to my heart that I could not be quiet night or day, but I must venture out in my boat on board this wreck. And committing the rest of God's providence, I thought the impression was so strong upon my mind that it could not be resisted, that it must come from some invisible direction, and that I should be wanting to myself if I did not go. Under the power of this impression, I hastened back to my castle, prepared everything for my voyage, took a quantity of bread, a great pot of fresh water, and a compass to steer by, a bottle of rum, for I had still a great deal of that left, and a basket of raisins, and thus loading myself with everything necessary. I went down to my boat, got the water out of her, got her afloat, loaded all my cargo in her, and then went home again for more. My second cargo was a great bag of rice, the umbrella to set up over my head for a shade, another large pot of water, and about 2 dozen of small loaves or barley cakes, more than before, with a bottle of goat's milk and a cheese, all which with great labor and sweat I carried to my boat, and praying to God to direct my voyage. I put out, and rowing or paddling the canoe along the shore, came at last to the utmost point of the island on the northeast side, and now I was to launch out into the ocean, and either to venture or not to venture. I looked on the rapid currents which ran constantly on both sides of the island at a distance, and which were very terrible to me from the remembrance of the hazard I had been in before, and my heart began to fail me. For I saw that if I was driven into either of those currents, I should be carried a great way out to sea, and perhaps out of my reach or sight of the island again, and that then, as my boat was but small, if any little gale of wind should rise, I should be inevitably lost. These thoughts so oppressed my mind that I began to give over my enterprise, and having hauled my boat into a little creek on the shore, I stepped out, and sat down upon a rising bit of ground, very pensive and anxious between fear and desire about my voyage, when, as I was musing, I could perceive that the tide was turned, and the flood come on, upon which my going was impracticable for so many hours. Upon this, presently it occurred to me that I should go up to the highest piece of ground I could find, and observe, if I could, how the sets of the tide or currents lay when the flood came in, that I might judge whether, if I was driven one way out, I might not expect to be driven another way home, with the same rapidity of the currents. This thought was no sooner in my head than I cast my eye upon a little hill which sufficiently overlooked the sea both ways, and from whence I had a clear view of the currents or sets of the tide, and which way I was to guide myself in my return. Here I found that as the current of ebb set out close by the south point of the island, so the current of the flood set in close by the shore on the north side, and that I had nothing to do but to keep to the north side of the island in my return, and I should do well enough. Encouraged by this observation, I resolved the next morning to set out with the first of the tide, and reposing myself for the night in my canoe, under the watch-coat I mentioned, I launched out. I first made a little out to sea, full north, till I began to feel the benefit of the current, which set eastward, and which carried me at a great rate, and yet did not so hurry me as the current on the south side had done before, so as to take from me all government of the boat. but having a strong steerage with my paddle, I went at a great rate directly from the wreck, and in less than 2 hours I came up to it. It was a dismal sight to look at. The ship, which by its building was Spanish, stuck fast, jammed in between two rocks. All the stern and quarter of her were beaten to pieces by the sea, and as her forecastle, which stuck in the rocks, had run on with great violence, her mainmast and foremast were brought by the board, that is to say, broken short off. But her bowsprit was sound, and the head and bow appeared firm. When I came close to her, a dog appeared upon her, who, seeing me coming, yelped and cried, and as soon as I called him, jumped into the sea to come to me. I took him into the boat, but found him almost dead with hunger and thirst. I gave him a cake of my bread, and he devoured it like a ravenous wolf that had been starving a fortnight in the snow. I then gave the poor creature some fresh water, with which, if I would have let him, he would have burst himself. After this, I went on board, but the first sight I met with was 2 men drowned in the cook-room, or forecastle of the ship, with their arms fast about one another. I concluded, as indeed probable, that when the ship struck, it being in a storm, the sea broke so high and so continually over her, that the men were not able to bear it, and were strangled with the constant rushing in of the water, as much as if they had been under water. Besides the dog, there was nothing left in the ship that had life, nor any goods that I could see, but what were spoiled by the water. There were some casks of liquor, whether wine or brandy I knew not, which lay lower in the hold, and which, the water being ebbed out, I could see, but they were too big to meddle with. I saw several chests which I believed belonged to some of the seamen, and I got 2 of them into the boat without examining what was in them. Had the stern of the ship been fixed and the forepart broken off, I am persuaded I might have made a good voyage, for by what I found in those 2 chests I had room to suppose the ship had a great deal of wealth on board, and, if I may guess from the course she steered, she must have been bound for Buenos Aires, or the Rio de la Plata, in the south part of America, beyond the Brazils to the Havana, in the Gulf of Mexico, and so perhaps to Spain. She had, no doubt, a great treasure in her, but of no use at that time to anybody, and what became of the crew I knew not. I found, besides these chests, a little cask full of liquor of about 20 gallons, which I got into my boat with much difficulty. There were several muskets in the cabin, and a great powder horn with about 4 pounds of powder in it. As for the muskets, I had no occasion for them, so I left them, but took the powder horn. I took a fire shovel and tongs, which I wanted extremely, as also 2 little brass kettles, a copper pot to make chocolate, and a gridiron. And with this cargo and the dog, I came away, the tide beginning to make home again. And the same evening, about an hour within night, I reached the island again, weary and fatigued to the last degree. I reposed that night in the boat, and in the morning I resolved to harbor what I had got in my new cave, and not carry it home to my castle. After refreshing myself, I got all my cargo on shore, and began to examine the particulars. The cask of liquor I found to be a kind of rum, but not such as we had in the Brazils, and in a word, not at all good. But when I came to open the chest, I found several things of great use to me. For example, I found in one a fine case of bottles of an extraordinary kind, and filled with cordial waters, fine and very good. The bottles held about 3 pints each, and were tipped with silver. I found 2 pots of very good sacade, or sweetmeats, so fastened also on the top that the salt water had not hurt them, and 2 more of the same which the water had spoiled. I found some very good shirts, which were very welcome to me, and about 12 and a half of white linen handkerchiefs and colored neckcloths. The former were also very welcome, being exceedingly refreshing to wipe my face in a hot day. Besides this, when I came to the till in the chest, I found there 3 great bags of pieces of 8, which held about 1,100 pieces in all, and in one of them, wrapped up in a paper, 6 doubloons of gold, and some small bars or wedges of gold. I suppose they might all weigh near a pound.